Dajahao, and welcome to Q&A, live from the studios of the Shanghai Media Group. I'm Tony Jones. Answering your questions tonight, former Ambassador to China, Dr. Jeff Raby, the Program Director of Greenpeace China, Ma Tianzi, former journalist, now businesswoman, Mei Yan, Chinese-Australian artist, Guo Jian, and the presenter of Chinese State TV's Biz Asia program, Cheng Lei. Please welcome our panel. Thank you, and as usual, being simulcast on ABC, on the Australian network, on ABC News 24 and News Radio, and viewers outside China can join the Twitter conversation by using the Quanda hashtag that just appeared on your screen. Well, this special edition of Q&A is a collaboration between ABC International and the Shanghai Media Group. Over the next week, Shanghai will host visits by the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, his senior ministers, as well as all of Australia's premiers and dozens of Australian CEOs. Well, China is now Australia's most important trading partner, but is our relationship on track? Our first question comes from Joe Lau.
Thank you to the panel. Is Australia sending mixed messages to China by, on one hand, pushing hard for trade, and on the other hand, conducting military sort of exercises with the US, with its pivot to Asia, and its aim to contain China?
Jeff Raby, let's start with you.
I get an easy one to go with. Thank you. No, I think the messages are quite consistent. We have, for a very long time, had a very clear and well-established security relationship with the United States. That hasn't changed. China knows that. And they're very pragmatic in China, and they're not thinking about how they could peel Australia off from that. The pivot speech that was made in Darwin some time ago by the former Australian Prime Minister, it was confusing for the Chinese in as much as they were asking themselves, what is the message we're trying to send? But the reality of it is not so significant in as much as the Chinese would be happy to have 5,000 fewer troops in Japan or South Korea and have them in a place called Darwin. So I don't think it's a big shift or change. I think the challenge for Australia, though, is that China is such a huge and important trading partner, and we just have to get the right nuance in our messaging. But I don't think there's any change in the message in substance.
Jeff, the former Prime Minister Paul Keating accused President Obama of verballing Australia from the pulpit of the Australian Parliament when he announced the Marines and so on, and talked a little bit about the pivot. Did that seriously annoy the Chinese leaders?
I think, again, it's a question of what are the messages we were trying to send on that occasion. But I think they, like us, generally saw that speech as purely for US domestic political consumption and had very little to do with Australia or China.
Cheng Lei.
I think you come back to economics because the relationship on trade, on business is a very, very important one, as you've been saying. And let's look at Kevin Rudd. He might be the best known Prime Minister to the ordinary Chinese, but during his time, what were Australian-China ties like? A couple of things happened, namely Rio Tinto, that perhaps didn't go down too well with the Chinese leaders. So you do always have to split off the politics from the business.
Do you think the Chinese leadership, though, worries about the pivot to Asia and Australia's role in that with its alliance with the United States?
To be honest, I don't think Australia is a big priority for the Chinese leaders.
But
from that perspective, don't take me out of context.
But I think, one should look at a different way. And these days, millions of Chinese are sitting in front of TV and watching Australian Navy, helping try to search for the lost black box and search for the airline. And that is tremendous goodwill demonstrated by Australian government, Australian people, and Australian military.
Do those sort of things really make a difference, do you think?
Yeah, I think that the friends in need, friends indeed. And that is
old
the
Confucian
trust.
saying.
Yeah, that's all the Confucian. And that is the trust that is going to cement the two countries' relationship. I think that both leadership should really capture the momentum, of this positive public sentiment to improve two countries' ties.
Guo Jian.
I think that's the actually doing something. I watched this news yesterday. Actually, people saying Australia and China actually both they already detected some of the signals from the ocean. I agree with Mei and the both. Actually, it's the time we get together, do something together, make it together. Yeah.
Why do you think that means so much? I mean, these particular things are very symbolic, I suppose.
Go onto the Chinese Twitter sphere and you look at the comments about Malaysia. There is
what's the Chinese Twitter sphere called? Because you don't actually have Twitter.
There is Weibo, there is WeChat.
Yeah.
Both are very popular, and there is a lot of, I wouldn't say hostility, but a lot of resentment towards Malaysia for their handling or mishandling of this whole crisis. And now in comes Australia, and this is a great time to hone the image internationally.
The Chinese are really impressed by this high professionalism and this efficiency demonstrated by the Australian military and the Navy.
Let's hear from Ma Chenji.
Yeah, if you look at the message from the Chinese Weibo, I think the overall message from the Chinese netizens, they're very positive towards Australia. People think Australia provides reliable information, that they really treasure that. So I think it's really a good opportunity for the Sino-Australia relationship to enhance throughout this process.
Jeff, do you think that's true as well? I mean, symbolism you've talked about as being important, that this sort of stuff can evaporate pretty quickly, can't it?
Yeah, but when it's happening, we really need to take advantage of it. And I think the comments are right, that it's another element in the relationship. It helps to reinforce the message that the relationship's more than just trade or more than security dimensions. There's very deep cultural, people-to-people links. I mean, after all, Australia is one of the largest destinations for Chinese students studying abroad, and it's a major destination for tourists. There's much more to the relationship than what often gets public attention in the media.
Well, the relationship has had a few publicly debated flaws, and one of them is a subject of the next question from Jaylin Wang.
Good evening. My question is that this year is the critical moment for the negotiation between China and Australia for the free trade agreement. And at the meantime, the world still remembers that Australia's Prime Minister Tony Abbot's depiction that Japan is the best friend of Australia in Asia. So in this context, what is Australia's stance on the issues such as Diaoyu Islands, East China Sea, and Mr. Abe's visit to the Yasukuni Shrine? So, and how will Australia balance the relationship between China and between Japan? Thank you.
Jeff Brady, we'll start with you. It is a difficult question. You were an ambassador, of course.
So it's not hard. No, well, maybe Japan might be Australia's best friend because today on the news, Australia and Japan have signed a free trade agreement. And we've been going since 2005 trying to negotiate a free trade agreement with China. So there might be a need for China to hurry up as well and help us conclude this negotiation.
But although China might, just referring back to that, or the context of that question, China might also take the view that on the same day, the Prime Minister Tony Abbott opened up a new and stronger security relationship with Japan.
They may, but I also think that in this case, new governments, like the Abbott government, it takes them some time to get the messaging and the nuance, the narrative right. But there isn't for us a choice between Japan or China. Both are incredibly important partners to Australia. The usual formula we use is we have no better friend in the region than one or the other. And I think that is really where we come out. The main thing for Australia in these issues, like the disputed islands and so on, is not to find ourselves unnecessarily in a position where people feel we have to make choices. We really don't have to take a stand or take one side in these matters, but be a good interlocutor and friend to both countries.
I mean, we do know that the Chinese leadership takes a slightly less nuanced view on this. After all, the Foreign Minister gave Julie Bishop, our Foreign Minister, a public dressing down over this issue.
a slightly different context in that there was a very public representation made in Australia to the Chinese ambassador, and an unusually public representation. And again, I see this as part of a new government with training wheels on. We tend to make those sorts of high-level representations in a more subtle, quiet way than we did on that occasion.
But I do want to point out why the Chinese have such a chip on our shoulders about Japan. It's because the way the rhetoric in the media is controlled. Say 3 decades ago, Japan was our best friend. We had tremendous people-to-people exchanges. My dad, before leaving for Australia, had to change his flight and go sit in a hotel for 5 days because there was a special plane carrying these goodwill ambassadors from Japan, youth ambassadors. And if you look back to the news papers of that time, all the headlines, it was all about friendship. And so I think the people who are getting up in arms today about beating Chinese drivers of Japanese cars up or bashing them to death are forgetting that.
Yeah, but what happened then? Because when the Prime Minister of Japan goes to visit the war shrine, shrine for the war dead, that offended a lot of Chinese, didn't it?
It always does.
I think it shouldn't just annoy Chinese. I think in a lot of the Western coverage of this tribute to this war shrine, I think it's underreported a lot in Western media, I think largely because of the language issue. I've been to there as a tourist, and I myself was quite shocked of what's, for example, being sold, the books that are being sold in the gift shop. For example, if you look at it, the whole denial of Japan's wartime history should not just annoy, for example, the Chinese. I think the Korean people are also quite annoyed. I think even the US people should also be alerted. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, I think, in this year's World Economic Forum made a comparison to the Nazis, the German equivalent of Germany denying the whole history of Nazi aggression in Europe.
But are the Chinese textbooks, history textbooks, accurate in depiction of, what happened during the war?
But I'm saying that there's some legitimate concern there. Yeah.
There is legitimate concern. Partly, the problem's partly though because the Chinese government has used nationalism and anti-Japanese rhetoric to legitimise the Communist Party's rule. So it's very complex. You're right. There is a real historical problem.
There is subtle brainwashing.
Sorry, I'm jumping now.
That's all right. You're an artist. You're allowed to do that.
It's like when we look back to the history, right? Diaoyu Dao is always there, right? But why just now we mention this again, right? I think this is just part of this politician sort of agenda to rise up something against something.
To camouflage.
Yeah, exactly. So when I saw this news when of a leader, right, back to visit to Germany, the German actually gave him sort of a map there, which is China used to have this big country there. How much we lost there, and no one mentioned that, and then now we mentioned the Diaoyu Dao. It's just nonsense. We got so many things there. You never ever mention that, but why only just this one?
But Courtjen, a lot of these issues you'll never resolve through appeals to history or international law. When China and Japan normalised relations in 1972, Deng Xiaoping and the Japanese Prime Minister at the time just said, let's set this aside for future generations who'll be wiser. Unfortunately, it starts to look like the future generations are not as wise as their predecessors.
I'm going to bring Mei Yan here. The question was really about Australia's relationship with Japan and whether the Chinese leadership would be annoyed, for example, that Tony Abbott has today actually made or strengthened a security relationship with Japan, because one of the fears of the Chinese, obviously, is of being contained by a collection of countries, including Japan and the United States.
But I think that Tony Abbott should pay attention to the Chinese public sentiment. And I think one has to trace back to the source of problem. And that's the Abe regime's attitude toward the war, toward history, toward the crimes they committed. And unless they change their attitude, and the Chinese sentiment will be there, and will not change. And that will not help improve the country and the regional relationship. And Tony Abbott really should pay attention to the Chinese public sentiment.
How seriously do you think this territorial dispute over the islands actually is? Because we know the recent party conference, Premier Li Keqiang warned Japan that China will safeguard the victory of World War II. Do you think there's any chance at all of actual conflict between Japan and China?
I don't think that the conflict will come in such a drastic way, but there is some public sentiment build up. And this is not just a small island, a rock island sitting there. It's a symbol of the sovereignty of the territorial claim. And that's something that the Chinese hold very dearly. And no country should overlook that kind of public sentiment.
Jeff Raby, it was over this issue, of course, that Julie Bishop got herself into hot water with the Chinese foreign minister.
Well, it was over the announcement unilaterally by China of an air identification zone without any consultation with any of the neighbours. That's a slightly different issue, and it's hard not to see the Chinese action as slightly provocative, but it wasn't specifically over the disputed islands.
Okay, let's move on. We've got quite a few questions to get to tonight. Our next one comes from Jenny Chen.
Good evening. My concern is about air pollution, and my question is for Mr. Ma. And people need jobs, so those factories cannot close down. People buy cars for their convenience, so more and more cars will run on the road. My question is, what's your prediction about air pollution of big cities in 5 or 10 years? And in your opinion, what's the feasible measures in China to control the air pollution? Thank you.
Yeah, Ma Tenji.
Sure. I think, first of all, air pollution is definitely one of the biggest issues, not just the biggest environmental issue, but the biggest issue now here in China. Last month was particularly bad around Beijing. We have a whole week of very bad air. People are really concerned about the air quality that they're subject to. So this has been recognized as a big issue also by the central government. If you're asking me to predict what will happen in the next 5 to 10 years, actually the central government has already laid out quite an ambitious plan to tackle air pollution. To the point of 2017, they want to reduce pollution. For example, we are sitting in Shanghai now. They want to reduce pollution by 2017 to 20% lower. And that means that China has to make some quite large structural change to its economy. Currently, it's still very much relying on heavy industry and this kind of very intensive manufacturing industry such as steel, cement, relying on coal as a major energy source. And for the Chinese government to tackle the pollution problem, they have to make a fundamental structural change to lower the percentage of coal as a major source of energy and to boost other renewable sources such as wind, solar, even including natural gas, to make the energy mix more reasonable and sustainable for a country like China.
I'll come to that in a little more detail in a moment, but can you just give us an idea of what the pollution levels are when they get really bad in the capital city, Beijing, where you live? I know that it's actually measured in PM 2.5 particles, which are particles that actually absorbed through your lungs into your bloodstream.
Yeah. We all have an app.
Yeah.
Where we read it every day.
You have an app.
We have an app.
You check it every day.
So explain how bad it gets.
Last month there are 7 days in a row where we have levels 10 times or even higher compared to WHO standard for what's considered safe air quality. So the WHO standard is 20, Chinese national standard is 35. We often have like 400 or above in Beijing.
400.
Yeah.
Over.
Yeah.
And over.
So can I just ask you this? We keep hearing that this is the big issue on people's minds in China at the moment. Is it the sort of thing that could destabilise a government that didn't fix the problem?
It's not just a biggest issue in Chinese people. mind. That's also the biggest issue on government mind. And Li Keqiang just recently said that during the NPC's report, said the improve people's well-being is the government top agenda. And I think the government will do something like Mr. Ma just said, that they have to fundamentally change the energy source and they're using. Use some alternative energy source rather than heavily focus on coal. And that is really polluted our city and our river and everything. That's all heavily polluted.
Before we come to you, Jeff, we've got another question on this. We'll go to that. This is from Huang Ling.
Good evening. My question is very short. My question is as follows. Renewable industries in China produce just a tiny fraction of the country's overall energy needs. Does Jeff Rabbit think China can kick the coal habit? What could it mean to Australia? Thank you.
Jeff, as you can see, that was for you anyway.
Well, thank you. And that was precisely the topic I was going to touch on. I should say, though, I'm on the board of a big coal company, a Chinese coal company, Yancoal, listed in Australia on the ASX. And my daughter's joined the Green Party, and I said to her, whatever you do, don't tell them your father is on the board of a coal company, especially a Chinese coal company. She said, no, Dad, I've worked that out. I won't tell them that. So, look,
what are your dinner table conversations like?
Well, luckily she lives in Holland. She joined the Dutch Greens. So. Look, the big problem is that, like Australia, China has massive coal reserves, biggest coal reserves in the world. It's the biggest coal consumer. And coal is the cheapest form and most available form of energy. And coal accounts for nearly 70% of China's base energy needs. It's not dissimilar to Australia. As in Australia, as in China, coal was going to be a major part of the energy mix for a very long time. China's doing a lot of nuclear. It's got probably the biggest renewables program in the world. But there is just a fundamental reality of the amount of coal.
Yeah, the reality is in the proportion of energy and what is used to produce it, of course. And even though they have this remarkable renewable energy project and the hydro, that accounts for less than 10% of the energy they burn, effectively.
Exactly.
So I want to ask Ma Jianji, how do you actually fix that? Is there the will to do it?
I think we're already seeing sort of this end of a commodity super cycle. The coal boom is going to end. I think that's even like people within the Chinese coal industry is projecting that coal consumption is going to peak around 2025. Economists such as Deutsche Bank, they're projecting that coal consumption need to peak already in 2016 for the government to be able to lower PM 2.5 level to about 30 in 2030.
So let me just go to this. There's a Greenpeace report which I've read that says there's been a massive expansion of coal production in northwest China. Jeff's probably responsible for some of that. With some of the biggest mines in the world, some of the biggest coal-fired power stations now being built, along with coal-fired or coal diesel conversion plants all operating together. I think there are 16 of them. What is the impact of that against the idea of lowering emissions?
Part of the expansion is the result of the fact that coal price is currently so low in a lot of part of China that the coal industry is desperate to create more values from the coal that they're producing, overproducing. And that's the whole coal diesel idea that came from. And I think they're trying to find ways to, for example, move coal towards the western part of China where pollution was still not that big an issue. But
is that an out of sight, out of mind?
Yes. I think there's part of that. But the challenge is that the western part of China is particularly dry, very dry. And these kind of projects, massive coal-based projects, they take a lot of water. For example, if you want to produce diesel out of coal, you consume, for example, 4 to 7 tons of water for 1 ton of product. And it doesn't make sense in areas where like a lot of the Chinese people rely on that already diminishing water tables for livelihood.
Yeah, I mean, your report set it out. 10 billion cubic litres, I guess that is, of water, equivalent to 1/6 of the annual total water volume of the Yellow River, is being used for these coal plants.
Yeah.
So is this just local governments trying to get more tax revenues and employment for their provinces?
Well, the local governments are not benefiting. A lot of them are not benefiting from these projects because these companies are registered in cities like Shanghai and Beijing, and they pay tax to Shanghai and Beijing. Yeah. And they are often like state-owned companies which have a lot of like power politically. So a lot of the local governments, even themselves, have some concern, but they cannot stop those projects.
Chang Li, let me go to you on this because how can China, on the one hand, say it's going to reduce its emissions? It's going to have to go to Paris next year, to the next version of the Copenhagen conference. And people are going to wonder whether China will actually come up with a plan to reduce its emissions and a target to do that. But if you're simultaneously building these vast coal-burning power stations, how can you do that?
Well, overall speaking, slower economic growth is going to help somewhat. And shifting to more services-oriented economy is going to help somewhat. So rather than, as Martin Jie was saying, the energy-intensive industries, the heavy industrials. But what is really heartening is the change in mindset, including in the media. For example, before the Olympics, when there were reports that American marathon athletes were going to bring mouth masks to race, the state media made a joke out of it. They said, you know, that's just going to be a waste because we have clean air here, and PM 2.5 doesn't hurt people, PM 10.0 hurts people. And change that to now. Fast forward 6 years, you've got, last month, a senior minister at the Ministry of Environment Protection saying to state media that when he told the Beijing cabbie who he was and where he worked for, he got a 30-minute lecture from the start to the end of his ride. And also the joke that, you know, for that week in March, when the air was good, the joke was that the air is good because all the Parliament delegates are here and they're full of wind. Yeah. So this is so much out in the open now. Yeah. You know,
is it sort of a wedge for free speech in the media, this issue?
For sure, because everyone's concerned.
Everyone's
and it's a boon for the air purifier retailers.
Yep.
Well, John, you live in Beijing. What's it like dealing with this every day?
I came from a really little town from southwest China, right? Which is like the water's clean, the mountain's green. And I come to Beijing in the 1980s. That time, to me, is already bad, right? But now it's totally bad. So, look,
do you wear a mask every day? Or?
We try actually, there's a few of artists actually trying to do this. They actually demonstrate this in Tiantan, a park there. And they've definitely been taken by the police. So everybody really affected to this now. So
yeah, I walk my dog.
Yeah.
I walk my dog every day, and I put on the mask, and my dog is sneezing.
There's an
that tells you something.
opportunity.
You can't really live like that, can you? Especially not your dogs. Look, we might just leave that discussion there because there's so much else to talk about. You're watching Q&A live from Shanghai, across Australia and across the region on the Australia Network. Our next question comes from Gavin Burton.
Good evening. China faces some big economic challenges. Massive government expenditure on state-owned enterprises and infrastructure has created overcapacity and low returns in many industries. Also, there is the shadow banking sector and local government debt, which is somewhat opaque. And finally, a property boom that has created a number of empty or ghost cities. Given these issues, what is the future for China? The government has announced an ambitious reform agenda. Will these reforms be enough? Or is China, as some commentators suggest, a huge Ponzi scheme? Either way, what will be the impact on Australia?
Jeff Araby, we'll start with you.
This is a couple of hour program, is it? Look, China's future economically is quite bright, in my view. I've been studying and looking at the Chinese economy for the best part of 35 years. And I've always been an optimist, and thus far, I've been proved right. One day I may be proved wrong.
You're not only an optimist, you describe yourself as a Pamplona economist running with the bulls.
Exactly. But I do know when you run with the bulls, you can slip and be gored in awful places, so unfortunate places. So there are risks in that call. But look, just to run through some of those things quickly, I think a lot of these issues are just over-exaggerated in the Western media. The ghost cities, there's only ever 2 cities mentioned when you see Western reports, Erdos in Mongolia and Wenzhou, and both of them are outliers for particular reasons. They don't represent the norm. Shadow banking is not a bad thing. It's a market response to a banking system that's largely constipated and is unable to lend beyond the state-owned sector. They don't know how to price risk, and it chokes off the small and medium-sized enterprise sector.
But does anyone actually know how much debt is held in the shadow banking sector?
Well, as much as you know anything here, there's an idea. And the absolute size as a share of the total GDP, because don't forget, this is the second biggest economy in the world now, it's huge. These debt levels, be they municipal or shadow banking, in absolute terms are not that big, but their growth in the last few years has been very fast. And that's what's got people in government here worried and focused on the consequences. But I think all of these problems are manageable given the scale of the economy, the fact that central government debt is very low. They're sitting on $4 trillion worth of foreign exchange reserves and have still a lot of levers in their hands to manage their way through these issues.
Let me go to Chen Lei. This $4.5 trillion worth of foreign reserves is often brought up, and I suppose the question is, does the central Chinese government think that it can just buy its way out of any huge debt problem?
Well, I think the description in the Chinese media is that China as a country is rich, but the people are poor. And so now the challenge is to spend some of that money, or whatever other $1 trillion that China has, on its people, because social welfare has really been inadequate, to say the least. But just to put China's development in perspective, I was born in '75. The first few years of my life, I think my parents were both university graduates, probably fed me cabbages and fermented bean curd. Mm-hmm. That's all people were eating. Mm-hmm. And even when we left China in 1985 for Australia, my mother was making 48 yuan a month as a physics teacher. And now, the problem that we have, all the problems that Gary mentioned, including, today is Qingming Festival, and the biggest gripe that Chinese netizens have is the traffic jams and the tourist jams at, places like Hangzhou, all the pretty places in China. That's got to be a good problem to have if you look at where we were and where we've come from. So
yeah, when the question asked that said about the Chinese government is going to further reform, and just like Li Keqiang just recently said, that Chinese reform has entered a deep water zone. And what does that mean? That means the emphasis in the past on quantity and speed is gone, in with the quality and the sustainability. And in my lifetime, that many of my generation still remember that once upon a time, the Chinese government used to set up top numbers for all the Chinese to achieve, and from every school kids and to workers and the peasants, they all have a certain numbers to reach, and that is achievement. But now that era has gone. And, right now, when we talk about this top line, instead the government is talking of a bottom line. And they're saying that the GDP growth can swing from 7.5 to 7. And that gives a lot of flexibility. And that cannot imagine in the past. And now this government, they say, as long as you hold the bottom line, and there's a lot of rooms for the companies, for individuals to make improvement, to make innovation, and also for the government to correct the mistake and to repair the damages.
One of the remarkable things if you think about it, China's growth is around 7.5%. If it dips below 7%, people
Still
think
high.
it is a disaster equivalent to a recession.
No, I agree with Jeff that this is one should not worry. One
The
should
mindset has got to
one
change,
should
right, from
worry,
looking at the GDP
but should
number.
not lose sleep over it. China's economy.
Tony, just consider this quickly. Remember 8 years ago, the Chinese economy was half the size as it is today. Then it was growing 10, 12% a year, and everyone was just dazzled by it. 7.5% of an economy that's twice the size it was 8 years ago is like growing at 10 to 12% then. I mean, that off the base. The base has increased so dramatically.
The economy's grown so much.
It's huge, yeah.
I'm going to interrupt you there to go to another question on this subject. It's from Peter Arkell.
Thanks, Jeff, for taking my punchline. We have surveys of Australian business in China, operating here in China over the last couple of years, and overwhelmingly the attitude is, the business sentiment is positive. Something like 83% were either positive or very positive about their outlook. Yet we hear and read analysts from the West, including Australia, talking about every statistic that comes out as being some sort of crisis that's going to befall China, and therefore Australia's well-being is going to be put at risk. It seems strange to me why there is this stark difference between the reading of the economies, those that are living and working here and those that are observing from afar, when 7.5% represents, another way I've heard it expressed, Jeff, is that 7.5% adds the equivalent of the South Korean economy to the world economy every year. That's a fairly significant contribution.
We should point out that Peter Arkell is the chairman of the Australian Chamber of Commerce here in Shanghai. So, Jeff Raby, do you want to quickly answer that?
Oh, look, I agree.
I think you sort of more or less have already.
Yeah, exactly.
Does anyone else want to get in on that?
Well, if we don't look at the GDP number, but we look at questions like are startup companies listing, whether in overseas or in China, where are state-owned companies still making as much money? Are the Wenzhou speculators still hoping for asset price inflation, or are they investing in real projects? If real structural changes are happening, then regardless of whether it's 7.5% or 6.5%, it's all good.
Do you have real statistics available to you, though, to examine these things?
Not at this moment, not a full comprehensive pile of data, but there is certainly a lot of anecdotal evidence about activity in the private sector.
Are you feeling the benefits of the economic boom as an artist?
Not at all. Never also the one penny to Jeff. Never sold a penny in China. So.
Sold one to Malcolm Turnbull too, didn't you?
Yes. That's why I was still back to Australia.
Let's move on. We'll go. Next question is from Jack Yuan.
My question is to the entire panel. I'm wondering, how many years do you think it'll be before China can have its own show like Q&A, where ordinary people can directly question political personages and people in the public about the issues of the day?
I'll go to Cheng Lei on that first.
Well, in China, censorship, it happens on many levels. For example, TV is one of the most tightly censored because it's available to the masses, whereas print media gets off much easier. And then
how is that done, actually? Does the censor or the propaganda department get involved in this and issue edicts? How does it work?
There are the propaganda notices, which come out on a daily and also ad hoc basis, depending on what happens. I mean, prior to the Beijing Olympics, it just built up to this multi-page affair that covered everything from you must not gossip about, Vladimir Putin's hairstyle to how to report tennis player Li Na's victories.
What was the issue with Li Na, by the way?
At the time, she was basically using her actions to denounce the state sports machine. And gradually, this has come to be accepted. So all these things change over time, but there are controls.
Well, let's get it. Have you felt these controls? You're a former CNN reporter, so in that role you wouldn't have felt the controls, I suppose, but you would know about it. After all, your father was a senior figure in the Mao dynasty.
Yeah, having been a journalist myself in the Western organization and have grown up in a media family in China, that I have to say, censorship is a universal thing. Every country, every media organization has its own kinds of control over its media product and the news content.
Did you experience that in CNN? Did you get edicts from a propaganda department?
Sure I did. Yeah. But I just think that one cannot and should not use one single benchmark and measurement to criticize other countries' media policy and media control. And I think that, in the last 30 years, all of us have witnessed a tremendous sea change in the Chinese media landscape. The fact that we are sitting here doing this live broadcast itself is the best proof that China has changed, has transformed completely.
I think we should at least make it clear that it's live into Australia. Whether it goes live into all of those villages and that we're talking about, obviously the leadership is more nervous about that.
Of course, there's still lots of rooms, to make improvement.
But can I just bring you back to the question, though? The question was really about whether a program like this, a group of people like us sitting around talking frankly about all of these issues in Chinese on the state television broadcast, could that happen?
The time will come, and it's still, ask Chen Lei, it's somewhat, it's not as open, but still the things are changing. And I have to say that the change cannot be pushed to, pushed to happen. The change has to come, especially in China, the change has to come at its own pace and on its own terms.
We've got another question on this before I bring the other panellists in. It's from Chao Chun.
Hi. My question is related to also the censorship. Have you ever felt your values or even the truth be compromised in such a censored kind of environment? And also, how do you maintain your integrity and also your creativity in such an environment?
Well, let's go to Guojian first.
Actually, I was really want to jump in the last question. But my case, I really agree with this. The change definitely is going now. It's on. But my case, when back 25 years ago, when I was in Yuanmen Arts village there, the police coming, they don't say anything. They just come in, to check everything, to take everything, or maybe send you to some sort of re-education camp, that sort of thing. But now they come and they're really nice, right? But they
still take your things.
They don't take your things now. They talk to you and then they say, "Oh, do you want to have tea or have dinner?" So we call this have a tea, right? This is a sort of term of. So they're really nice now. Seriously.
Does it feel sort of sinister though? Come and have tea and talk about your artwork with a party official.
For the beginning, we were really nervous to have a tea with them, right? But now it's just now, why don't we have drinks? Right? So we can have drinks now. So.
What do they say to you? Do they look at your work and say, well, this piece looks a little bit edgy to me?
More just if you feel comfortable with your studio, if you have some problems with your studio, we can fix up with you. Or what you do, right? And they asking the questions about your works. And you tell them usually I just block myself from them. But now I freely...
Because your style of work, it has to be said, is known as cynical realism. So you take the old propaganda idea of propaganda art and you...
I was a propaganda artist,
You were? And you're cynical about it now.
Yes, back to let's say this back to 20 years ago. If I do this, I definitely got troubles, right? Including in the studio. And now I think I might not get a show publicly, but I could do in my studio. And they come up and they still say something. So, oh, why you do this? Why are you doing this? And when I tell the story, they say, oh, maybe it's not the time to show. That's it. So I think censorship is still really strong, remain there. But I agree with that. one day we definitely go through that. Yeah.
Let's hear from Shanghai on this. The question really was about whether you had to sort of, in a way, compromise yourself at any stage. Did you, in your career, have to do that?
I think it's much easier to criticise and to hold very absolute standards on so-called integrity when you're not here. I think it is more meaningful for me to be within the system and to feel that I am effecting change, as May said, at a steady pace. And
did that mean, by the way,
yes.
as a television presenter, you actually had to join the party?
Not at all.
No.
I work for the English channel. For the Chinese channel, I do believe you have to be a Communist Party member to host especially general news shows. And so for the censorship standard for the English channel is much more loose, because if you can understand English, if you can get over the firewall of China, then you're not really a threat to the...
Yeah, let me bring you in on that. The firewall of China was mentioned, and of course there isn't a great deal of absolute freedom, is there, when Twitter is banned and Facebook and YouTube and the New York Times, the Guardian and various other organisations. You simply, I've tried doing this while I was here, you can't go online and get any of those social media outlets or those news outlets.
Yeah, but I think these we're talking of change, and I would still think that the change cannot be pushed to happen. Things has already changed tremendously. One need to see the progress. One need to see the improvement that China has made and give it time. In the 5 years from now, we probably talk on different things. And right now, yes, you cannot get a YouTube, you cannot get Twitter. And, but the Chinese, they have a WeChat, they have all the Chinese things. And they are doing exactly the same that Twitter and YouTube do. So
we just use euphemisms and acronyms.
Yeah, that's, we always say the Chinese Twitter, we didn't say the WeChat. So that's exactly, but I think that things in China should come incrementally, and the firewall will eventually come down.
Ma Chenji.
My answer to that question about how to deal with censorship is simple: just to play with it, to interact with it, to dance with it. That's how we did as Greenpeace in China. Last year we had this press conference challenging this big coal project, China's biggest coal company. We have a full house of journalists came to our press conference knowing that they couldn't report on our story, but they decided to come anyway as a show of support to our cause, and we used that as an opportunity to mobilize people on internet to help us break the censorship, to spread the message on like Weibo and WeChat. And so yes, there is censorship and it's becoming more and more sophisticated, but I think people are also starting to finding ways to go around with it, and also to challenge it in their own capacity as journalists, as netizens, as ordinary.
Do you see it like this, that freedom is sort of an unstoppable virus?
I think the trend is very clear. I think even within the government, they're seeing that the old way of censoring is not working. For example, in a lot of cases, journalists start to ignore the sort of ordinance they send on a daily basis, because they have access now to social network websites and things like that. So I think, and also within the government, I think there's a diversification of interest. For example, on the issue of air pollution, the Ministry of Environment, for example, would love to see more discussion on air pollution. And this makes the central government more difficult to put a blanket ban on a certain topic, because even within the government there are space and dispute on whether they want to silence things to that extent.
And also lots of people already learn how to jump the wall. We say 翻墙.
That actually brings us to our next question. Now, this is Q&A for the first time ever, live from China, and a fascinating discussion it is too. The next question comes from Frank Wang.
Good evening. My question is, do you really think that China one day will become a democratic country? By democratic country, I mean that freedom of speech, freedom of religious faith, and freedom of gathering I also mean that when can we have a nationwide election of our president? So another relating question is that, do you think that, is it true that the system of checks and balances or the three branches of the government power is not suitable for China? Thank you.
Jan, let's start with you.
Wow, that's a tough one.
Well, we're exploring the boundaries.
Yeah.
What do you think? China capable of becoming a democracy? Let's start with that.
You know, I just mentioned that one cannot use one single benchmark or measurement to measure the other country's system and then to judge other countries' system. And things will come in time, that's for sure. And then given that time, and don't push it, and then otherwise it will backfire.
Is the fear that with democracy could come some form of chaos the central government could not control?
In the past, you cannot imagine that people sit here doing a show in Shanghai. And this is a total news blackout. In my lifetime, I have seen that. And this has really changed a lot. And I just say that one probably, never lived in China in the past, and that you wouldn't know that time that people craving for news. When Gang of Four was arrested, and I have to, lock the door and whisper to my mother in the air that so, everyone can really celebrate that news, because that's really scary. Something like that is whether it's gossip or it's rumor. But now these things is quite a public debate, a public discussion. It's all on WeChat. You cannot really stop a news from spreading. And because that people read New York Times, Wall Street Journals, and people read, watch CNN, watch BBC, and watch ABC, Australian ABC. And that, they can tweet out or WeChat out, and then to let other people know.
I'm sure we're not really on the end of that queue. Jeff Raby.
Well, I was wanting to jump in to say, but of course, ABC, unlike the BBC and CNN, doesn't have landing rights in China, so you can't see the ABC here. Look, I think the question is the question of our age and of our time, because China is a one-party authoritarian system. It's changed, as Mayan has said, enormously, and from what it was like in the 80s when I first lived here. But it is the question that we have to come to grips with, that what will be the political evolution of China? And on all these big questions, it's hard to give a definitive answer. But I do think it's not very helpful to just assume that there's only one path of political evolution for a system like China. It's only had representative democracy in the 1930s in a sort of fashion for a very brief period. It may come, it may not. Yeah. But I think what's evolving in China are quite unique to China forms of political and social organisation, and within that, greater space is being opened up in people's lives. The problem is, and the big problem, is you can never have the rule of law in China. You have rule by law, but you can't have the rule of law whilst the Communist Party is running the show. But the Communist Party provides political stability and enables everything that you see here to have happened over the last 35 years. So it's a real tension. But there are models, and I often say that Singapore is not a bad sort of model for China. People laugh and say, well, Singapore's a tiny island, this is a massive continent, how can they be? How can it be a model? But Singapore's not really a democracy either, and it doesn't really have the rule of law. But
they did have that historical figure here, Sun Yat-sen, who had the idea of guided democracy, which is more or less what you're talking about in Singapore.
Yeah, or Confucian paternalistic authoritarianism. Dad runs the family, okay?
Yeah. Mao Chen-ji, what do you think?
I think in a lot of cases, I think when people talk about democracy, there's too much an emphasis on this regime-shattering aspect of democracy. I see it from a different perspective, because I think the foundation of democracy is the ability for people to be able to self-organize and self-govern. And in that aspect, I'm seeing a lot of progress in China. I'm using this case of the 2008 major earthquake in Sichuan province, where you see tens of thousands of Chinese people volunteer into this earthquake-hidden area and self-organize into like support groups to help the victims and help even the military to deliver some like aids into the area. At that time, they created some sort of mess because people don't know how to organize and don't know how to get things together. But if you look at last year, another earthquake hit Sichuan, and this time the volunteers are much more organized and they know how to like deliver goods. They know how to deliver aids in a like self-organized way without the intervention of government. And in that line, I'm really seeing the seeds of democracy growing in China. Maybe not the regime shattering kind of way, but it's growing.
Zhang Lei.
Yeah, I agree with that because there's too much emphasis on rights when you talk about democracy, whereas you tend to ignore the responsibilities that come with it. You need a certain level of selflessness, you need to be able to organize, you need to be interested in affairs. For example, a lot of Chinese kids who grow up in Australia, they're lawyers, pharmacists, doctors, accountants. Very few want to enter public service. Why is that? You know, and perhaps that same thing is here. You become you go into public service because you can become an official and perhaps, you know, make a better living, but you don't do it for the altruistic aspect.
I'll just quickly go back to one part of that question that was asked, and that is, could you imagine a time when the president of China is actually voted for?
Well, right now we're at the very, very, very early stages because you know how the legislature works. The only direct elections you have right now is at the village level, and even at the village level you have bribery and corruption and protests and so on. So if we can't even work that out, then you know you can't expand that to a whole, you know, up the chain.
I think that's every Chinese dream that one day they will be able to vote for their president. However, that things will happen that when China has strong social and cultural and political foundation. And so far that China has progressed and improved in the last 30 years. 30 years, it's just a blink in the long Chinese history. And the social foundation is still very fragmented and still very shaky. So without that solid social foundation, you talk of these lofty dreams on the democracy and the voting election, and that is destructive rather than constructive. So that's my point of view.
You're watching Q&A live from the Shanghai Media Group studios in central Shanghai on Nanjingshi Road. There's time for one last question. This one comes from Chujie Jung.
It is a bit hard to say that Chinese and Australian people are knowing each other well, even when we are dealing with substantial international business transactions. There are only three topics that Chinese people will discuss about Australia: kangaroo, Great Barrier Reef, and the environment. Beyond these three topics, Chinese people know little about Australia. On the other hand, Australian people only know the Great Wall, terracotta warriors, and the dumplings about China. This is quite tricky issues. So my question is, how could we develop personal connections that change perceptions of two nations? Thank you.
We've only got time. Thank you very much. We've only got time for brief answers. Jeff Arabi, we'll start with you.
Well, I certainly think cultural relations and cultural exchange is very important. When I was ambassador, I started the Australian Writers' Week specifically for that reason, to try and have a conversation between writers of countries, Australia and China. I think more cultural exchange, what Guojian does and so on, is extremely important for that.
Zhang Lei.
More shows like this?
More shows like this. Well, we'd happily come back. We'll have to wait and see. The Australian budget will probably decide that. Let's go to Guojian. I should not have said that. Guojian. Freedom overtook all of us just for a moment.
No, just back to the last question, which is we talk about the democracy. Sorry, I was really want to say that. We talk about back to the question that I really believe that the day will come, because when the Communist Party took power, they promised that. 60 years ago, they promised that. So I definitely believe that. I'm waiting for that.
The question is really about how do you...
We need to have more Australian young people come here to study. I think personal experience will fundamentally change their perception about the country, about this culture. And then we see lots of young faces sitting in the audience. I think this is a good thing that, once they're living in China, once they have Chinese friends, they would know this country, open their arms toward Australia and toward the people in the world. And China is a very friendly country. Am I right?
Yeah, I'll give you 2 thumbs up for that one as well. Ma Chenji.
Well, as an environmentalist, I myself was inspired by Australian philosophers such as Val Kilmerwood, and I don't agree that Australia is all about kangaroos. I think Australia has a unique position because it's the only Western liberal democracy that's physically close to China. I urge Australia to use that as an opportunity to become a center of ideas that can inspire the Chinese people.
Thank you so much, and that is all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Jeff Raby, Ma Chenzi, Mei Yan, Wo Jian, and Cheng Lei. Thank you, and very special thanks to this wonderful Shanghai audience, Australia Network and the Shanghai Media Group. Please give yourselves a quick round of applause. And we have to go now, so until next Monday night's Q&A, good night.